in the gospel today, we hear of our Lord's temptations. And the first thing I want you to notice is that he allowed himself to be tempted. And the reason he does so is because he knows that we will be tempted, that is what we have to face every day of our lives, that inevitably there is temptation. And that we need to have the strength to overcome that temptation. And that, I think, my brothers and sisters, is what really separates the saints from many of us, is how to handle temptation. Because that's where sin begins. It begins in temptation. As we heard in that first reading from the book of Genesis, right? How our parents first sinned. It began in a temptation. So we must really work on overcoming those temptations, but we don't have to do it alone. Jesus goes into our weakness and shows us how we can be victorious in every and all temptation, to be the saints that we're called to be. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, let's look at that first temptation. We're not going to go all three because we don't have time, but that first temptation. So what is that first temptation? The first temptation is to turn these stones into bread, right? And we hear that Jesus is hungry. So the first temptation, the devil is working on Jesus' natural, because he's got a body, he's a human being, he's a man. He's got natural desires, food, hunger, thirst, fatigue. He suffers those. And it's really interesting. It says that he hadn't eaten for 40 days and 40 nights. So what does it say? He was hungry. I think that's an understatement. Right? He was starving. Right? And oh, yes, I want some bread. But he's not going to give in to that temptation, because what that temptation is about is you, because you may be the Son of God. You notice how he says that. He says, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. Guess what? You have the power to do whatever you want right now. You can fill that desire. You're hungry. You're starving. Yeah, take that. Do that. Well, that's the same temptation that he uses in a lot of us. Right? When we have those bodily needs and those urges or those things that we think we need, that we're hungering for, the devil's going to say, you have the power to do that. You can reach out and take that. Look at how beautiful that fruit looks. Take it, take a bite, eat, satisfy, fill yourself. Fill yourself with the bread of the world. And that's why Jesus says, and he was interesting, he said to turn those stones into bread, but that's why Jesus responds with it's actually a quote, or from this passage, a passage from Deuteronomy, it's chapter 8, verse 3, says, one does not live on bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. So what he's saying is that you are not going to be able to satisfy your hunger. No one can satisfy their hunger with the earthly bread. I mean, he could have turned every stone in that desert to bread, and it still would not be enough to satisfy the hunger that we are meant for. We're meant for every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. That is what is going to satisfy us ultimately. And so I think to overcome that temptation is to know, and that's why Jesus brings that out, to say, look, you're not made for the bread of the world, you're made for the bread of heaven. And so when you have that temptation, and I'm going to challenge you in this season of Lent, we all are hopefully giving up something, right, as penance. And you've already been tempted 1,000 times probably since, if it was really tough, something to choose to give up. But since Wednesday, you're probably tempted a lot, and you will continue to be tempted, because it's interesting, like we give up something, then we see that thing all around us, right? When you try to give up like donuts, and everybody has a donut in their hand, especially when you go outside. Anyway, so what you want to do is realize that thing that you want, that you are hungering for, is really not what you're hungering for. What? Because what you're hungering for is God. What you want is infinite love. You want infinite comfort, peace, security. You want joy, love. life, infinite love, infinite life. And those things in the world are just means to get to that end. They're not the thing in themselves. So what I want you to do is see the thing that you are really wanting and what you're really hungering, and that is God. And you can do that in every desire and everything that comes up in your heart that you want. Say, you know what, I really want God. Now, if I start thinking about God, what am I doing? I'm praying. Immediately, I'm starting my prayer. So let's try that this Lent. Let's try to overcome these temptations that are going to face us, and that's why we take on these practices. That's why we take on these practices of penance, is to be able to strengthen and grow in our relationship with Christ, of course, and to overcome temptation, not just in Lent, not just to do it for this 40 days, but for the rest of our lives, so that we can be the saints that we are called to be. And so finally, when our Lord, of course, says that we live by every word that comes from the mouth of God, he's saying that we live by him, because he is the Word. Jesus is the Word made flesh. We know this from John's Gospel. He says that the Word was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So Jesus is that Word, and so what he's saying is we need to live on him. That's who we want. That's who we're hungering for. And so there must be a way that he's given us to feed on him, to eat him, to have him. And what is that way? The Eucharist. He has given us a way to have that heavenly bread, to satisfy every and all of our desires, the deepest need of our hearts. So let us be aware of that, especially when we come up for communion, how we come up, how we're receiving. Be prepared to receive. Go to a confession. Have a good confession. So really in this time of Lent, really to be ready and hungering for him, knowing we're hungering for him and that he is here to satisfy that hunger. Not with the bread of the world that we're never going to satisfy ourselves, only with him, who is the bread of life. Because we don't live on bread alone. We live on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God.